And welcome back to More Talking Law TV, and we're here in this segment with Judge Ann Barnes from the Georgia Court of Appeals. Hi, Ann. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it, and I love being here in Savannah.
Well, thanks for coming down. You work for the Court of Appeals, and that's made up of 12 judges. Exactly what is the Court of Appeals?
Well, the Court of Appeals is the second highest appellate court in Georgia, the first being, of course, the Georgia Supreme Court. The people of Georgia elect 12 judges to the Court of Appeals, not all at once, but every 6 years a certain number of us are up for re-election, and we decide cases of all types, excluding death penalty and constitutionality of statutes and a few more esoteric subjects on all kinds of matters. The trial courts of Georgia, of course, hear the evidence and make the initial decisions, but we're a court for the correction of error. We sit in panels of 3 and review the evidence and the legal arguments, looking to see whether or not the trial court should be affirmed or reversed for a new trial or an entry of a judgment other than what the trial court found.
So you said you sit in panels of 3. Does that mean that once the 3 of you determine something, the other 9 look at it as well, or just the 3 make a decision?
Well, it depends. If all 3 of us decide that the case should be reversed, for example, we all concur fully in the decision, the case goes no farther in our court. However, if one judge, even just one of the 3 of us, dissents, it will go to a panel of 7 judges, or if it's a particularly important case, or if it's overruling a prior decision, then it would go to the full 12. Then, of course, after our decision is rendered, the Supreme Court has a right of certiorari, which means that they can review our decision. Roughly 90%, however, of the decisions of the Georgia Court of Appeals are either not reviewed by the Supreme Court or affirmed by the Georgia Supreme Court. So we make a lot of law in Georgia.
Yeah. Interesting, the first 2 levels are 3 and 7, odd numbers. What happens if you get to 12 and it's 6 and 6?
That has happened before. There's a special provision for that, and oddly enough, it is immediately transferred to the Supreme Court without a decision ever being issued. The last time that happened, I was the author of, they call it dissent in majority, based, although obviously 6 and 6 is a tie. But the tiebreaker went to the Supreme Court, and I was proud to say that my side prevailed. So
no sudden death in Georgia Court of Appeals?
No sudden death. We don't bring in a pinch hitter or anything.
Why would this Georgia Court of Appeals matter to the average Georgia citizen?
Well, the average Georgia citizen should care about truth and justice and law. And it's very important that we have impartial, qualified judges on our courts, because so much law is made in the Court of Appeals. Of course, most of the law is made in the legislature, but we have here in the United States something called a common law system. There are many times there are gaps in the laws that the legislature makes, and unclear or ambiguous areas. And of course, the Court of Appeals does not rule anything unconstitutional as far as statutorily, and we don't attempt to overrule the legislature, but in this country we have a rule of law, and it's very important that the voters educate themselves on their judges and be proud that they have the opportunity to vote in these elections. I know it's hard to keep up with all the political processes, but it's very important.
Does that differ really in how the U.S. Court of Appeals works, or is it pretty much the same thing?
Well, we do have a parallel system, and it is similar, although there's some significant differences. You know, just as we have United States senators who go to Washington, as opposed to our state senators who go to Atlanta, when there is an appeal, for instance, from the Georgia Court of Appeals, it goes to the Georgia Supreme Court. If there's an appeal to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. Also, our 11th Circuit Federal Court of Appeals is not just for Georgia. It includes other states, and it's very, very different in that sense. Also, they have different jurisdiction, statutes involving different matters that have to do with federal constitutional and statutory law.
Yeah. What's your typical day like behind that? Maybe in the chambers, or we'll call it behind the robe. What happens?
Well, a Court of Appeals judge's day is very different from a trial court judge's day. We generally have so many cases with so many written records. A trial court judge will review many written briefs and so on, but generally a trial court exists to give due process to the parties at the trial level. And a trial or a hearing at the trial court level, state or superior court, or even magistrate court and traffic court, involves witnesses, evidence. And a witness would be a live person, generally, speaking to the court, although sometimes they have depositions and such. Our evidence, which would involve, of course, speaking is evidence, but physical things can be evidence. Fingerprints, for instance, are a type of evidence. What the Court of Appeals does is look at the written record of the trial or hearing or proceeding below. And generally what we have is stacks and stacks of paper. Occasionally they will send up pieces of actual evidence to us, but our job at the point that I see a case is not to review the evidence and reweigh the evidence, but rather to see if the trial court judge has made an error of law in the court below. And many people, and it's important for people who are jurors or people who are voters to remember this, that our job is very different than that of a trial court judge. We don't weigh the evidence. We don't decide on guilt or innocence, liability or non-liability. Basically, we decide if the parties below got a fair trial or a fair hearing. And we don't, as some people would put it, give a do-over. Mm-hmm. Instead, we review the evidence to see if there is an error. In fact, it's said that the Court of Appeals is a court for the correction of errors.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on the show this week, and we hope you enjoyed tonight's show, and you'll join us again next week right here on Talking Law TV. Bye-bye.
Closed captioning services provided by the Web Advantage. Design, hosting, and multimedia solutions for businesses like yours. Produced by Tandem Productions. Distributed by Legal Eagle USA.